The role-playing genre is one of the oldest in the entire medium of video games, dating as far back as the late 70s, with many individual titles being inspired by the classic tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. Since those early days, whether the game was strictly text-based or some gargantuan blockbuster of unprecedented scope, the habit of grinding existed. Grinding is the act of repeating a cycle of actions over and over and over again to achieve a desired result, usually with the intention of giving yourself more power or abilities than the game expects you to have at that particular point. Grinding is the term typically used when the thing you're obtaining is experience points, in-game currency, or increased character stats. When you're grinding for items or equipment specifically, the preferred term is usually farming, a clear reference to the act of tending a farm. There are many types of grinding that exist within video games. Regular grinding usually involves just fighting enemies again and again. It requires active participation and is often seen as a huge chore. But some grinds don't need you to do that much work. You can mess with some settings and let the game do the tedious stuff on its own while you either sit and wait patiently or go and do other things. This is AFK grinding, and it involves either making a contraption of some sort, like mob grinders in Minecraft, or setting up macros, like for crafting in Final Fantasy XIV, to do all the dirty work on your behalf. In some cases, AFK grinding is simply taking advantage of passive game mechanics that are always running in the background regardless of what you're doing. And of course, different players have different levels of tolerance for grinding. Some people groan at the idea of even doing just 10 minutes worth, while a small collection of real nutcases love grinding so much that they try to hit level cap in the earliest areas of a game just so they can stomp on everything afterward. Beyond all that, there's also the discussion of the existence of grinding in itself. As long as RPGs have existed, so has grinding. And as long as grinding has existed, so has criticism of it. There's a persistent argument that suggests the presence of grinding is some inherent flaw and a symbol of poor game design, whether its allowance was purposeful or not. Today, in the terminally online world of 2023, this argument mostly comes in the form of a game making a grind so long and tedious that it's probably a ploy to get players to buy microtransactions to speed up the process. But 20 or so years ago, this argument wasn't like that. It was about the very core nature of grinding that was intrinsically tied to the genre. And this leads us to the topic of the video. What are some games that finally took the initiative to stop the player from grinding? And what methods did they adopt? You might be surprised at how many there are. Now, I should clarify, contrary to the title of the video, not every method is necessarily a punishment. Rather, some methods are just passive limitations the game was designed around. In fact, let's go ahead and start with that. One of the methods that takes grinding out of a game is what I like to call oops, all dead. This one is exactly how it sounds. You killed all enemies in the game, and they do not respawn, meaning it's impossible to grind and the game has a finite amount of experience points and levels to give you through combat. Generally speaking, when a game does this, it's because either the developers want you to commit to developing your character in a specific way, or because the game has a low level cap to begin with and you're expected to naturally hit it or get close to it by the time you reach the end. Thus, allowing the player to grind would be either antithetical to the game's intentions and vision, or just plain useless to do. Games that use this method include, but aren't limited to, Breath of Fire 5, Parasite Eve 2, Mass Effect, and Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. In Lightning Returns specifically, you actually drive monsters to extinction, and the final living one of each monster type is a powerful boss version. Some games skirt the line a tiny bit by either allowing a limited number of enemy respawns or containing respawns to very specific areas, like Parasite Eve 1 and Knights of the Old Republic. In the former's case, the chances of enemies respawning in a given area decrease with every fight in that area, so eventually it'll become totally impractical to even try to grind. Lunar 2 Eternal Blue subverts this in a very humorous way. In the early game, a temporary but very powerful character accompanies you through a dungeon that you're supposed to run through because it's filled with strong enemies. Obviously, some people would take advantage of this by grinding right then and there. But once you reach a certain level, that character becomes impatient and uses a spell that prevents battles from happening entirely, thus taking away your ability to continue grinding. Another method of preventing grinding outright is story progression level caps. This means the game has a hard limit to how many levels you're allowed to gain before you need to press on with the story to increase the limit and start leveling up again. There are a couple ways to do this. Final Fantasy XIII does not have traditional levels, but it does have the Crystarium, a very compact type of grid where you can increase each character's stats by spending Crystarium points. But no matter how many points you may have to spend, you need to expand the Crystarium by continuing the story. Eventually, you will unlock the full thing and you're allowed to grind as much as you want. But when that happens, the game kinda expects you to grind anyway because you'll have so many Crystarium nodes to activate. Another way of doing this is the Chrono Cross way, where stat increases are tied to how many bosses you've defeated. After every boss you beat, you're allowed to grind a little bit more to increase your stats by a few points. But once you hit that ceiling, which doesn't take that much time, you need to defeat the next boss to be allowed to gain more. It's actually a pretty effective way of keeping the game's pace brisk and telling the player, hey, you don't have to spend more time here than you need to. But it sort of makes non-boss fights feel useless to participate in unless you are farming for something else. The next method that's more humorous than anything is what I like to call cannon fodder. This is when your team becomes so strong for the particular area you're in that the game decides that you're too strong to deserve any real rewards for getting into more fights. And to show this, enemies on the field either run away from you or die immediately upon contact with you, typically yielding no experience points. For example, in Mother 3, if you dash into enemies who are too far below your level, you simply kill them instantly. In Digimon World for the PlayStation 1, if the Digimon you have with you drastically outclasses the enemies around you, they'll just run away upon seeing you instead of running towards you to initiate the battle like they would normally do. Trails of Cold Steel also lets you insta-kill enemies when approaching them from behind, but, generously, the game actually does drop loot if you defeat them this way. Of course, grinding is also typically associated with combat. So for this next method, what better way to prevent grinding than by redirecting the bulk of experience rewards away from combat and towards exploration and progression instead. In the original Deus Ex and Human Revolution, killing enemies typically yields no skill points and very little XP, respectively. Exploring the map thoroughly and completing objectives gives much greater rewards, which takes focus away from combat as a means of becoming stronger. The only real difference is that Human Revolution gives XP for every small action you do, so there technically is still an optimal way of gaining experience, but it won't matter that much to the majority of players because the difference isn't all that prohibitive. Now, let's finally be true to the video's title and go into mechanics that actually do punish you for grinding. Specifically, scaling. There's multiple ways a game can scale the experience to match your level, and this one is separated into two categories. A soft punishment that doesn't really affect your game in the long term, and a harsh punishment that has potential to ruin your playthrough and force you to start the entire game over again. Let's go with the soft punishment first. The most common of which is probably scaling down experience points the higher your level is compared to the enemies you fight. As you grind and gain levels in a particular area, you're obviously bound to outlevel the enemies you encounter. And to discourage you from continuing, the game will dramatically cut down the amount of experience points you get, and eventually you receive single-digit amounts or perhaps even none at all. This is the game telling you to stop screwing around and continue the story. On the flip side, with this system, it's typically pretty easy to help under-leveled team members catch up to the rest. So it's at least still possible to use this mechanic to your benefit. Games that do this include the Suikoden series, Dragon Quest VI and VII, and Final Fantasy Tactics. Now for the harsh punishment, and man, it is a doozy. It's enemy scaling, and it's a system that has sadly spelled the end for many people's first playthroughs of numerous games, because, unfortunately, some of those games do a horrible job at explaining how their enemy scaling works. Generally, when a game integrates enemy scaling, it discourages grinding by boosting the levels and stats of some or all foes in the game, including bosses, so that you're always experiencing a consistent level of challenge, regardless of how much grinding you do. This is already a very divisive mechanic because, to so many players, this feels like it defeats the purpose of leveling up at all. But to make matters worse, when you grind enough, some games will eventually give enemies a greater stat increase per level than your party gets. Meaning, if you grind too much, you will eventually reach the point where you start making the game exponentially more difficult for yourself from that point forward. The most glaring offender of this is probably The Last Remnant, which had a system called Battle Rank. The more fights you win, the higher your battle rank becomes, and the higher your battle rank was, the harder it was to gain stat increases after each fight. Meaning, it was ideal to purposely keep your battle rank low so you can maximize growth. Now, this system wasn't a bad idea in itself. The problem was that the game did fuck all to explain how it worked. So many people played the game for the first time and accidentally screwed themselves into a save file where even trash mobs were destroying them. It was pretty infamous when the game first came out, causing many people to feel soured on the experience as a whole. Another famous example of enemy scaling is Final Fantasy VIII, where all enemies in the game level up alongside you. It's the only game in the mainline series to have scaling of this type, but thankfully it wasn't as punishing as The Last Remnant is, and in fact, there was actually a reason as to why you might want to scale enemies up. In Final Fantasy VIII, when enemies hit new level thresholds, their drops become rarer and more valuable. You could also draw stronger magic spells from them in battle. Scaling was incorporated into the game to encourage the use of something called the junction system. And with this system, it was possible to make your party ridiculously overpowered without needing to level them up at all. Experienced players who know how to really manipulate mechanics to their benefit can turn at least one character into an unstoppable force of nature before the end of Disc 1, without even going past level 15 or so. In fact, it's possible to beat the game without leveling up any character at all. It was a highly experimental system, and one that ended up being quite divisive for its steep learning curve. But it was worth the hours of research because it rewarded you with remarkable strength. The next method of preventing grinding is potentially the most severe, maybe even more so than the harsh enemy scaling of The Last Remnant, depending on how you view things. This one's kinda hard to name, so we'll give it the broad designation of irreparable playthrough damage. It's not always as bad as that, as this is somewhat of a spectrum, but it can get pretty intense. In some games, there may be a limited time system, where you're expected to beat the game or at least make a certain amount of progress within a set amount of in-game time. The most popular is probably Persona, and in Persona 3, if you spend too much time grinding, party members can become tired, and they won't fight for a few days once you exit the dungeon. However, there is an upside to being tired, as it allows you to visit the nurse's office, which is an opportunity to increase your courage stat. On the flip side of things, some games have a much harder boundary on grinding by locking you to an undesirable outcome if you do it too much. One of the harsher methods is employed in Ogre Battle, a game which uses an alignment system that affects a number of gameplay and story factors. In Ogre Battle, it is considered evil or chaotic to defeat enemies that are of a lower level than you. So if you do it too many times in an effort to grind, you may find yourself pushed further and further towards a bad alignment, and thus a bad ending, potentially to the point where you can't recover. Similarly, you have a system like that used in Romancing Saga, which uses an event rank mechanic that keeps track of how many battles you've participated in, and will either activate or lock out quests based on that number. Meaning, if you spend too much time grinding, opportunities for rewarding quests and recruitable characters will be permanently locked away. A humorous implementation of this idea is in Tales of Destiny. For those who don't know, in Tales games, it's possible to set combat to auto mode, where the game controls all characters in the battle and fights for you. An easy way to grind in these games is to simply use a rubber band or maybe scotch tape to tie the left analog stick to one direction so the party wanders in a huge circle on the world map and auto-battling their way to victory. However, in Tales of Destiny, after about 20 minutes or so of this, an endgame boss named Barbados will pop up and specifically call you out for wasting time on grinding. He's essentially unbeatable, and to make matters worse, if you use an item during the fight, he retaliates with a mystic art that basically wipes your party out. It's possible to survive the fight by running away, but of course, if you left the game unattended to go do something else while the game grinded for you, then you're not going to be in the room to escape. Thus, Barbados will obliterate your party and you get to return to a game over screen. A very sinister, but genius and hilarious way the developers punish you for AFK grinding. Now, as a bit of a special category, I suppose, I also want to touch on anti-grinding mechanics used in MMOs. Yeah, you might normally assume MMOs to be the place where grinding was most acceptable, but it turns out some of them don't like it when you do it too much either. Let's start with EVE Online, which doesn't have levels or experience points at all. Instead, you gain skill points, which are earned through the passing of real-world time, including when you're not logged in and actively playing. Not only does this take active grinding out of the hands of the players entirely, it even eliminates long, non-stop sessions since progress is still being made whether you're playing or not. Basically, EVE Online eliminated grinding by making AFK grinding the default way of development. Most other traditional MMOs that have anti-grinding have them in the form of the same diminishing returns mentioned earlier, where the higher your level is compared to your enemy, the less experience you receive. But Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 did it slightly different. It had the fatigue system, where you would receive less and less experience after a certain amount was gained. This system was criticized because people assumed it punished the everyday player, when in fact it wouldn't kick in until many, many hours of non-stop playtime. It was highly unlikely that the average player would ever activate it, but that didn't stop people from complaining. However, when A Realm Reborn released, this system was recontextualized to rested experience, where you now gain an XP bonus the next time you log in after staying offline for a stretch of time. This is pretty ingenious on the part of Yoshi P and his team at Creative Business Unit 3, because even though both systems function fairly similarly, the former was disliked because it felt like a punishment, whereas the new system is liked because it feels like a reward. Just goes to show how important psychology is in game design. Now I want to mention a really fascinating one that I have never seen before. And this one isn't even an RPG. It's a vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up, or shmup. The Aleste collection is a bundle of old school shmups developed by the old genre masters at Compile, back in the late 80s to early 90s, for the consoles such as Sega Master System, MSX2, Genesis, and SNES. In the new collection released for the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch, the standard leaderboard is actually not sorted by score, contrary to what everybody would assume about a shmup. Instead, it prioritizes stage reached and completion time, meaning it's far more important to beat a run as quickly as possible than it is to use tricks to gain a ton of points. This is to discourage the act of boss milking, which refers to the act of gaining as many points from an enemy as possible by taking advantage of infinite or near infinite sources of points. This usually means keeping the boss alive for as long as you can in order to cause your score to explode. But since the standard leaderboard punishes long completion times, it's now crucial to forego milking entirely and just get the fight over with. And last but not least, I want to close out this list of methods with one special approach that swings things in the total opposite direction. Games that help with grinding and make it easier to do, should you elect to do it. There's a couple of key ways games do this. First is multipliers. Some games offer generous multipliers for every enemy or wave of enemies you defeat or hits you land. Ys Origin does this and allows you to build up to a 1.99 times multiplier. Another method that games help with grinding is allowing you to group together large numbers of enemies or chain together multiple battles one after another, usually with increased rewards as well. Bravely Second does this, and players who really know what they're doing can really sit down and go all in on intense grinding sessions. And sometimes, certain games will offer areas or levels that are dedicated specifically to grinding experience or some other type of resource. Disgaea does this a fair amount. After all, the series has an insanely high level cap of 9,999. Or 99,999,999 for Disgaea 6. So it stands to reason that each game would offer several opportunities to grind. That'll pretty much do it for all the major types of anti-grinding mechanics in video games. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive. There are more games out there with slightly different variations of what was mentioned. Some are clever, some are very straightforward, some are only minor barriers, and some are absolutely ruthless. It just goes to show that if a game developer doesn't want you to stomp on everything right out the gate, they have multiple ways of stopping you. My personal thoughts on anti-grinding mechanics are pretty open. I'm not inherently against them. In fact, I think that it's possible to implement certain methods in a way that complements the pace of the game. For example, the diminishing experience points for beating lower level enemies prevents strong party members from becoming stronger, but can easily lift up weaker members to match the rest of the team, and usually without requiring any extra effort on the player's part. Just like any other aspect of gameplay, it's definitely possible to choose an anti-grinding system that contributes to and enhances the overall experience, especially if it's in line with the developer's intended vision. Some games don't want you to have all the power, and will thus make you commit to a specific playstyle. Some games have low-level caps by design. Some games don't have experience points or levels at all, and have a totally different system for character development. It's a wide, open world. If there's anything that a game should avoid doing, it's poorly explaining its anti-grinding mechanics, especially when that lack of understanding might lead to a ruined playthrough. The Last Remnant was infamous for this, and still kinda bears the weight of that blunted first impression. It's not fun when you start a game thinking you're allowed to grind like normal, only to find out you're absolutely not. But you're several hours in and can't undo the damage. So your choices are to either try to push through the hell you accidentally made for yourself, or start a whole new game. While I do enjoy complex mechanics sometimes, such as Final Fantasy VIII's junction system, it's quite frustrating when there's an obtuse but really important feature that you can only really discover by tripping and falling into it too late, or doing preemptive research online, especially if it's a single-player game. This brings me back to something I brought up earlier in the video. the existence of grinding in itself considered a failure on the game designer's part. Do you feel like that's true? Do you think that if a game has the possibility for grinding, either accidentally or on purpose, then it's emblematic of poor design decisions or general ineptitude? Or do you simply accept grinding as an aspect of the genre that players can freely elect to participate in of their own free will? Nowadays, it feels like such an old, archaic debate to even have, but I don't doubt that for some small corner somewhere in the industry, it's a topic that some people still take seriously. Personally, I do lean towards the latter, as I always value and appreciate when a game accepts the fact that some people will want to break it. But at the same time, I respect when a game is clearly designed to disallow grinding as part of its core vision and experience. Either way, anti-grinding mechanics is just another avenue where there's no shortage of developer creativity. This concludes my video on RPGs that punish grinding. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.